Most people don't know me. I could walk in the rain without getting wet. And by that I mean I can dirty myself and my hands in the politics of a country without allowing the politics to contaminate me in the process.
Winston Dookeran is an honest, hard-working, sincere individual.
Look, here you have an honest man, a good man, one who would deliver, one who says he could do X and he will do X plus Y.
When it comes to power, people like Winston don't really see power for power's sake.
I always say I am what I am. Well, I am who I have turned out to be and who I am. I see myself largely as someone committed to the development of my country and also to ensure that I become a good professional in my career.
We were both from Rio Claro, both from the same village, you might say. So we knew each other from primary school, and then we got to know each other even better when we both went to Naprima College, where we spent many years together.
I remember him coming in St. Benedict's College to teach us economics in 1966. And here we had this thin, tall, slim teacher coming in named Dookeran. And he was a fantastic teacher. We did well. As a teacher, very friendly, very engaging, but we found him very knowledgeable in economics. And that because he could impart the knowledge that he had with a degree of fluidity, ease, and make us feel fairly comfortable. Microeconomics, which tend to be slightly more difficult than macro, we found it easy. So in fact, I got to love microeconomics more than macro. And that helped me to pass, A-levels economics under Winston Dookeran's tutelage. I remember I had to do, he gave me some home lesson in economics. And for some reason, I didn't manage to complete it. So the 2 days or 3 days after, he inquired about where's my assignment. And I sort of forged a weak answer, looking in retrospect, a weak answer. And he looked at me and he smiled. He said, look, you have the potential to do well, but you will never attain it if you don't lay the groundwork and start now. Bring my assignment for me in 3 days' time. I never forgot that. 3 days' time, his assignment was on his desk. He corrected it, looked at me, he said, well, you see you have potential, but you must be serious, you must be steady, you must be focused, because the future beckons you. And I never forgot that. And that helped to shape my whole outlook in everything that I do, throughout my whole career in the Foreign Service.
Well, I grew up at a time when Trinidad and Tobago was about to enter into independence. And the world itself had started decolonization in a global sense. Two individuals attracted my attention as a young man in secondary school. One was a debate that was taking place in the country at the time between Dr. Eric Williams on one hand and Don Basil Matthews on the other hand. And I was very much involved in that debate. It was really a debate about the philosophy of new societies. I don't think I understood it very well, but I was engrossed by the debate. At the same time, when I look back at what has happened in the world, the freedom movement in India had just begun to show fruits, and it started the whole process of decolonization. And one of the three leaders that I always was attracted to in terms of my interests was Rabindranath Tagore. He was a philosopher type leader. And I subsequently in life was given the privilege of doing a feature speech on him on his 150th anniversary here in Trinidad and Tobago. So I would think in terms of the people who influenced me early on would have been Don Basil Matthews on one hand in Trinidad and Tobago, and on the other hand would be Rabindranath Tagore, who was a key figure in the leadership of the freedom movement in the world. When I had just finished university in London, I took a trip to Moscow, a student trip, and we had to travel on the train for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. So I took with me at that time this book called Inward Hunger, and I found that most interesting, absorbing, and inspirational to read what was turned out to be the inner thoughts of Dr. Eric Williams prior to his involvement in the politics of this country. I found that book brought an urge in me to try and do something that satisfies my inner self rather than satisfying my outer being. I would consider the idea of satisfying one's inward hunger and the trials and tribulations. It may have applied to him at the time, and clearly it was quite an instrumental account of his life, inspired us to do the same. So when I returned to Trinidad many years later, or subsequent years later, I was able to do that. In between, I had met Dr. Rudranath Kapildev, who was then in London. He was at the University of London, where I was a student. He had finished his period in Trinidad politics, or at least he was in Trinidad politics, and we had a long discussion on the future of Trinidad. And I saw two different perspectives. I saw Dr. Ariels giving us a historical constitutional perspective, and I saw Dr. Rudranath Kapildev giving us a technological, scientific perspective on the future of Trinidad and Tobago. And that led me to believe that you can only develop a country through development rather than through politics per se. But I realized that politics and development are intertwined. So then I pursued the path of development. So in that sense, that book and Dr. Kapildev's own book on the issues of, I think he had written a book on an interpretation of the Gita from a Caribbean perspective, which I read at that time. So these things had an influence on me. Incidentally, my very early period was in the Economic Planning Division of the Prime Minister's office. And at that time, the Prime Minister was Dr. Eric Williams. And I got my early grounding in that office, working with people like William Dimas and Frank Rampersad on how to build an economic platform for a country. So I always had the urge to be able to do that. But I realized that if I had political influence, I perhaps would be far more successful in so doing. While I was at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada, I took the daring step to contest the presidency of the student body. Perhaps it was quite daring as a non-Canadian to do so, and I was successful. Somewhat to my own surprise, but certainly it created a new confidence in me about my role in public life. So when I returned to Trinidad thereafter, I joined the University of the West Indies and began the study of economics and politics. Taught there for 10 years before I began to feel the urge to get involved and dirty my hands in the affairs of the people. It is in that context that I met Mr. Pasdev Pandey, who came to the university to give a lecture and encouraged me thereafter to help him in his plight to provide a better future for the people of Caroni and the sugar industry. It led eventually to my becoming a member of his team for the election at that time. It was called the United Labour Front, and it came from a position in the political spectrum of attempting to create a compassionate perspective on the harsh economic circumstances of today. And I contested the seat of Chaguanas. I won, not by any major majority, but it took me into Parliament. I soon realized that that particular political platform was not adequate to be able to make a major change in the politics of the country. So I began to work with him and with others, including Carl Hodgson Phillip, A.N.R. Robertson, and Lloyd Bess, to create what turned out to be the National Alliance for Reconstruction. And then, by that time, in 1986, we contested the election as the National Alliance for Reconstruction and had an overwhelming victory. For the first time, a party outside the traditional and historical party of the People's National Movement. And that led me to the politics of the NAR. I became a member of government, and more specifically, the member responsible for planning. I was quite happy with that because it fit into my role as an economist, and it also helped me enormously to give action to all the thinking I've had and had developed over the many years, both at the University of the West Indies and elsewhere. And therefore, I began developing what was called the restructuring for economic independence of Trinidad and Tobago. That particular political experience had its pitfalls, and it did not survive its political articulation, largely as a result of the management of the economy, but more so because of the advent of the 1990 events. At that time, I was faced with a major crisis, and that is the crisis of democracy.
I would say his brightest political moment was immediately, well, during and after the attempted coup in July 1990. And that is where I think he shone, in my view, as a real national leader. Because with Mr. Robinson and most of our colleagues as prisoners of the Muslimin, he ran the government with what one might call a skeleton cabinet, of which I was a part. But there were very, very few of us. Most of our colleagues were captured in the parliament, and we had to run the government. And I think his astuteness as a minister and as the acting prime minister came out very, very clearly. For example, we were in a very dire situation. The Venezuelan president, Carlos Andres Perez, had made it very clear to us as a government that he was fearful that this was a kind of a proxy attempt by Gaddafi to take control of Trinidad, and from Trinidad make an invasion of Venezuela. That was the Venezuelan attitude. It was their belief. And so they made it very, very clear that if they saw that we were unable to manage the country, Venezuela was going to come and take over Trinidad, not permanently, but to stave off this alleged Gaddafi threat. So he would take it over, make sure that Gaddafi didn't get control, and then hand it back to us. He made that very clear. That was one quite clear indication that we had. Secondly, the Americans didn't want the Venezuelans to have any kind of influence in Trinidad. They saw Venezuela as their rival, as their competitor. So the American ambassador, his name was Gargano, was virtually living with us. He was there with us every day because the government was being run from the Hilton Hotel, and that's where we were all holed up and we were running the country from the Hilton Hotel. And Gargano was there all the time to stave off this Venezuelan threat, which he knew about. So you had the Venezuelan threat, you had the Americans, overlooking what we were doing, and then of course there was the country to run. And I thought Dookeran did an excellent job in maneuvering between Venezuela and the United States of America, and in keeping constant touch with his ministers who were there with him. And then there were the constant negotiations with the Muslimin. So that was an additional responsibility he had, to be dealing with the Muslimin, to be talking to them and making deals, trying to make arrangements, because they had allowed him to come out of the Red House.
In 1990, in Parliament, I was one of the hostage. One of the perpetrators came to me and said, when I raised my hand after Mr. A.N.R. Robinson was shot, and I felt it was my duty to raise my hand, with a bit of prodding on the part of Emmanuel Hussein, who was sitting next to me, that you got to do something in these circumstances. And he asked me, what do you want? And I said, well, I want to talk. And he said, who are you? And I said, well, I'm Winston Dookeran. And he said, no, I meant, what position do you hold? And I said, well, I am the Minister of Planning. He said, I'm sure you did not plan for this one. I said that if only because it was, in retrospect, a moment of humor, but it's also, in retrospect, a moment of relief. And that led me to play a central role in Parliament itself in order to assist in ensuring that the tension in Parliament be reduced and the catastrophe that was ahead of us be averted. The catastrophe was really a violent catastrophe. And even in spite of what we were able to achieve, 25 odd people had lost their lives in that particular event. So to me, that was a most traumatic experience. Having to negotiate, if you can use the word negotiate with inverted commas, an arrangement to try and diffuse that situation. And of course, subsequently, to be able to restore, as acting Prime Minister, the country's governance process.
He was multitasking. Americans, Venezuelans, running the country, and at the same time continuously negotiating with the Jamaat al-Muslimin through the army and through Colonel Theodore, who was head of the army and who was with us in the Hilton Hotel. So dealing with the Muslimin through the army and dealing with the Muslimin with the assistance of agents who had come from North America to be with us and to advise us as to dealing with the hostage takers. So that there was a whole range of activities. I don't know if he ever got sleep, because whenever we wanted to talk to him, he was there.
And I believe that he assessed the situation and he felt that he had to make a choice to be able to save the people who were hostages and at the same time to come out of a situation where the country could have been better. Now people see it and they label it in all kinds of ways, but if I were to look at that situation in 1990, what Winston Dookeran did was the right thing. And he exercised leadership that we needed at the time. It didn't have to be confrontational, it had to be more collaborative. He had to create some sense of peace and calm, and his personality in itself lends that ability for you to be peaceful and calm and to think in a rational way. So I believe he was thinking rationally, as opposed to what many people may think.
When the democracy was in crisis, that I felt that my sense of balance, I think, is really what helped me then. I learned that from my mother, who had a tremendous life in overcoming adversity. My father died when we were young, and I was 3 years old at the time, and she had to bring up her family of 7 children, all on her own, not being able to either write or read English, not having any form of income. Just give you that as a context. So the adversity, and I grew up in Rio Claro, which is a village in Trinidad and Tobago. And I was told that what I think she told us, how do you deal with adversity? You deal with adversity with a steady hand and with a clear head. I remember that growing up. And that, I believe, in retrospect, may have allowed me to have that in Parliament with a steady head, a clear head and a steady hand. Not at all allowing my deep emotions to take control of me, or at any time bearing in mind the greater good must always be my motive. Whenever there are issues before me, I try to decide on that basis.
So I think that was his finest moment. And I think it was largely because of his astute leadership. And I think the nation has to be eternally grateful to him. As a historian, I can't tell you of any other situation where the position was so tense over a long and continuous period as it was during July 1990. And there I think he stood out very outstandingly.
At the University of Manitoba in 1991, in the aftermath of the 1990 events in Trinidad and Tobago, did me the greatest honor. The Senate of the university called me one day in my office, to my astonishment, to offer me an honorary Doctor of Laws degree at the university graduation. To me, that was a moment that I could have never foreseen, could have ever happened. And he told me that because they were following the events in Trinidad and Tobago very closely as a fellow Commonwealth country, and they understood my role and they saw it and they got their own independent advice on this, that they were willing to offer me that honorary Doctor of Laws degree. Subsequent to that, I decided to pursue a professional career. And I was offered the position of central bank governor. And I took that position for a number of years, including 5 years, so to speak. And it was perhaps the best professional period of my life. When I joined the central bank, I considered it to be a great honor. I was about to embark on an international career with the United Nations. In fact, I was at that time a member of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And the offer came to me to head the central bank. I spent 5 years there. I consider it to be the period of my life which I enjoyed extremely, very much so. Largely because it was a mixture between technical work and political work. You had to understand the political direction and strategic options that were available to the country.
He became governor of the central bank at a very perilous time when the whole financial situation was wobbling. And to his credit, he stabilized the financial situation as governor of the central bank.
But you had to be able to also understand the technical aspects of economic development and more specifically monetary policy. So it was a period of great discovery. During that period, there was a great amount of instability in the foreign exchange market then, as it is now today, but perhaps more so then. And we had to grapple with the issue of the foreign exchange policy. Subsequently, Wendell Motley, as Minister of Finance, will come and introduce the floating exchange rate, which I thought was a very, very good move at the time to handle the situation which I had to grapple with in the central bank. But beyond that, the financial sector was expanding, and there were now many other institutions in place other than banks, and therefore we had to expand the regulatory remit of the bank and introduced regulatory controls over a number of other institutions. I consider that doing those two things were very, very important for the development of this country at the time. And apart from that, the central bank provided me with tremendous opportunity to get into the international arena because I was able to attend meetings all over the world on issues of finance, on issues of development, and on issues of a small countries' development. I later became a chief advocate for small countries on the international scene.
And as one of the best finance ministers this country has ever had. I don't know how many people know that the stabilization fund, the financial stabilization fund, was started by Winston Dookeran and Selby Wilson. That wasn't there before, but it was a brainchild of Dookeran and Selby Wilson, and that was started in the NAR period. And that stabilization fund, which when we were in the government, we built up considerably, that is now coming to the rescue of Trinidad and Tobago in this COVID period.
Well, at the United Nations, I also had the opportunity to address the United Nations General Assembly on more than one occasion. This was the political arm of it. The whole question of the reform of the United Nations has always been an issue, continues to be an issue, and I became a particular advocate for the voice of small countries in the UN restructuring process. And I use those opportunities to so do. Subsequently, at the United Nations, I got involved with Latin American development in particular, and was able later on to chart the course of Trinidad and Tobago, to give it a new option beyond the option of Europe and America to the option of Latin America, and was able to create opportunities for the Latin American Development Bank to be established here in Trinidad and Tobago, and to give us a new direction in terms of our destiny. I think that is only the beginning of a new direction that would emerge over time. At the end of that time, the political situation in the country appears to be unraveling in a very uncertain way. And it was brought to my attention that people like us, people like me, ought to get involved in a full-blown political effort. And so I returned at the end of my term as governor of the central bank to the political front. At that time, the whole politics had changed, and the new party that was in opposition to the People's National Movement was the United National Congress. I therefore attempted to fight the election, and I did, in St. Augustine this time, as the representative of the people of St. Augustine, and won that particular seat. That too found itself into difficulties, and as such, it did not last for very long. And I myself began to become very frustrated and wondered whether there was need for me to continue in a political life. During all that period, I maintained my career as an economist at the university and elsewhere, and built my own professional reputation as far as I could in the circumstances. But I realized that all the technical and economic measures that we were pursuing required political support. And therefore, it led me to another attempt to enter the politics. So I entered again into politics in the aftermath of my central bank tenure. That led again in this fragmented politics in which we are to a set of disillusionment. And therefore, I decided that I needed now, as I always felt I had to do, complete my pursuit of finding a different platform. And then I formed the Congress of the People, a party in which I became a key person and brought together what I considered to be a new generation of politicians. Contested the election in 2007.
Well, the Congress of the People came out of an impasse between Basil Pandey and Winston Dookeran. And at the time too, the country was looking for something that was different from the traditional parties, and he felt that he could make a difference. So what he really did is to pull together a group of people whom he felt had the country at heart. And I was very happy to be part of that process. And together we were able to galvanize the population and also recruit a lot of very brilliant people whom we felt could have led the country. And it was a marvelous experience, and I believe even though we did not win any seats, we made a difference and we were able to kind of impact on the national consciousness. So even today, people still talk of the Congress of the People, and they remember some of us, I believe, with some sense of love and pleasantness and wish to some degree that we could have made it in those days. So it was a wonderful experience, and he was an excellent leader in taking us through those times.
Yes, I think that he made an error when he formed his own political party, in that he didn't understand clearly enough that this country is a two-party country. And the history has shown that previously, his attempt to form a political party, the Congress of the People, wasn't the first. That had been done quite frequently before he started his party. And the evidence was very clear that this country is a two-party system country, and that any efforts on the part of third forces is doomed to failure. That's my interpretation of the situation. And I don't think that was his interpretation. His interpretation was finally that a third party can come and make a breakthrough and break that monopoly of the two-party system. And in that regard, I think his reading of the political situation was not accurate, and therefore he went, formed a political party. The party did well, but, according to the voting system we have in this country, a third party didn't stand and still does not stand a chance of breaking into that two-party monopoly. And I think, that was the error he made. But, it was a noble attempt to bring the nation together.
Winston should not have done anything differently because he was himself, and the thing with politics is that you reach people where they're at. You could share with them your message, you could give them some hope, you could inspire and motivate them, but in the end it boils down to the person's personal choice. So what he did, that was part of his legacy. If it means just to stir up our consciousness as a nation, for us to have seen something that could have been, and maybe one day we will be ready for that. But I don't think he should have done anything differently. And I believe a lot of the times he had to hold himself back because he realized he could have been a victim of people who didn't believe in his way, in his humility. As a matter of fact, there were people who would say to him, he did not have oomph. What does that mean? Because he's not pushy, he's not the kind of person who would become flamboyant and just use audiences and use people. He was not like a traditional politician. He was an intellectual, and at the same time, he had that commitment. So that's a good combination for a politician, but unfortunately, that's not the model that we aspire for as people.
Many thought that that was much more than a daring move. They thought that it was almost an impossible task. But I was quite happy at the end of it all that we were able to win a substantial share of the popular vote. I think it was somewhere about 23% of the popular vote. But given the system in which we operate in, we did not win a seat. But notwithstanding that, the party continued to grow and grow in leaps and bounds. The country had come to the stage, in my view, that they wanted a new generation of political leaders. And they were willing to provide that to the group that we had brought together in 2007. I continued to build the party with the hope that it will grow in strength and time, and perhaps at the next election, we probably will have a stronger mobilization force at our disposal. But in between, the Prime Minister at the time, who was Patrick Manning, whom I'd grown to respect and today continue to respect as an individual and as the Prime Minister, called a snap election. My response to that, when I was asked by the press, what would you do as a young party if there was a snap election, which was in the air at the time? I said that if there is a snap election, I will have a snap response. Not knowing exactly what that response will be. It turned out that he gave me the opportunity to have a snap response. And therefore, I joined and created what was then the People's Partnership. The history is there now, that also formed the government in 2010. And therefore, I then became the Minister of Finance in that government. Well, at the time I became Minister of Finance, the country was on the cliff of a collapse in the financial sector, and more specifically, a collapse in the finances of the country. And the Clico fiasco, as it was called, had its impact in the wider Caribbean. So not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but in the rest of the Caribbean. And my very first assignment was to how do I tackle that issue? We were able to put together a package that eventually was with some controversy, but eventually became a success story. And we were able to prevent the country from falling over the cliff. And that particular legislation that we had to put into place, and it called for a lot of legislative as well as technical work, but more so legislative work, to win the support of the Parliament, including the independent senators at the time, to me was a major achievement in terms of legislation. By the end of the term, even that experience seemed to have faltered in many different ways. So by 2015, I had decided that the political platform upon which I was building was at variance with the situation in the country itself. And I decided then that I will not continue in electoral politics as such. I felt very disillusioned and disappointed with myself when I had to give up the COP. Not for any political reasons, but because there are many people who had put their faith in me. I knew I could not satisfy it, but I felt very disappointed and disillusioned that I had to do, people like them and many others. They didn't hold it against me per se, or maybe they did, I don't know, but I did feel disappointed. But I continued in my search by going back to the university, by going to the United Nations, by joining the University of Toronto as a visiting professor, and began a new part of my career, which is in writing. And that is where I am today. But the first book I did was called Forging a New Democracy. That was for the formation of the NAR. I brought all the political parties together in Valsin Teachers College at the time. And I said, let us discuss what divides us and what unites us. What we found at our conference is that nothing divided us. Tapia, DAC, ULF, nothing fundamentally divided us, because it was really an issue of personalities rather than an issue of ideology or policy. And I did that first book with a colleague by the name of Rafael Sebastian. That's way back when. That set the basis for the NAR. Because when Carl Hodgson Phillip and A.N.R. Robinson and Lloyd Bess and Paseo Pandey met, I showed them that they had nothing to divide them, unless they had an ego to handle. Now, I was just, I didn't say it in these words, but that's what I was kind of suggesting. And made it easier to forge the National Alliance for Reconstruction, the NAR. The book that emerged out of the governance process was called Power, Politics and Performance. It's about governance. It's almost the expression of what I did in the NAR government as Minister of Planning, and then what I did in the PP government as Minister of Finance. And I look at power, politics and performance. And that is when my thinking began to shift from policy to power. In the last incarnation, in the partnership, it came clear to me that power was more important than policy. Clear. That to me is my best book from an academic point of view. Then I subsequently, when I went into Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I began to look at issues of diplomacy and Caribbean integration, and what we should do. The other book I did is called Crisis and Promise in the Caribbean, Politics and Convergence. So that's that book. So it comes out of my desire for a different Caribbean society. And in that process, we ended up having a conference in 2015, the last year of my government. With the University of the West Indies, we organized a major conference in Trinidad on the future of the Caribbean. I brought people from all over. I think there were over 600 people there. So Hilary Beckles came and gave the address, and that's when I got to know him. And based on that, he subsequently invited me later on to join him. And that book is called Shifting the Frontiers. So those are my 3 recent books that have already been published. And the one that will be published in April is published by the University of Toronto Press. I give you the publisher because these are books that have merit as academic and scholarly work. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not just books. University of Toronto go through a very arduous process before they publish it. That one is called The Caribbean on the Edge. The political stress of equality. And the book that I will bring down the curtain on my publishing, I think, is this last one that I've just got approval last week from the University of UWI Press to publish this book. This will be a big one. This is not me alone now. I've brought everyone I can think of, both here and abroad, to look at the post-COVID situation. What will happen to thinking with respect to development and diplomacy in the post-COVID era? Most of my books are meant to be for students and practitioners, not popular books. They are meant to be for that purpose, and hopefully they will be used for that purpose.
Winston is a good blend of intellectualism, politics, and love for people. And I really wish that we could have more of him in Trinidad and Tobago. We really need that now. We're dealing with a pandemic especially, and we're looking for enlightened leadership. People who will put country and people before everything else. And in Winston's time, that's the kind of person that he could have been, and it's unfortunate that he didn't get that opportunity in the way he should have been given it.
Those who are proper judge of history wouldn't realize that Winston Dookeran made a monumental contribution to the economic growth and stability of our country, both in good times and in bad times. But he was steady and focused.
For me, the best memory was like, I was at my office at Mount St. Benedict, and he was the acting Prime Minister, and he decided he wanted to visit me. And he came here with his whole entourage, and I was like amazed, you know. And we sat maybe for about an hour just talking, and I realized that he was looking for a sense of peace and calm and to just get in touch with, the roots level. The fact that he could have come and visited me at Mount St. Benedict and to sit and have a conversation for an hour told me what kind of person he was. He didn't forget where he came from, neither did he forget the people who worked with him and to support him, throughout his career.
He is a very good family person. I'm very familiar with his relationship with his wife and his son and his grandchildren and his nephews and nieces and all of the siblings. And all of them, particularly his nieces and nephews, look up to him, Uncle Winston, for guidance in any problem they have.
He had an abiding belief in the Almighty, in that God will always, or his Brahma will always pave the way, and that you must do the right thing at all times. At times misunderstood, very rarely acknowledged, but he will get his reward in heaven. Winston Dookeran has been one of the greats, one of our unsung heroes. He hasn't really been acknowledged or recognized for his contribution for the development of our society. But history will take care of that.
For the progressive people, Winston will always be seen as someone who was a gift to Trinidad and Tobago. For those who could not be like him, maybe they might be a little envious, they wish they could have been like him, they will be negative. They may perhaps think that he was not strong enough. But I believe strength is not about the pursuit of power. It's about how well you can influence people, how well you can emulate good human values. And he brought a decency to politics, which will always be a mark and leave a mark in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is part of his legacy. So when we speak of decent politicians, if I can name one person, that will be Winston Dookeran.
On my tombstone, I would just like to be remembered really as someone born in Rio Claro who dared to break barriers in my life. And Rio Claro is a small village in Trinidad and Tobago, and I was proud to grow up in that village. I am what I am.